Good morning from the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Susan Anderson Smith, and I'm the Associate Rector for Justice and Reconciliation here. I am delighted to welcome you to this time with our guest, J. Chester Johnson, who will be discussing his latest book, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation. Good morning, Chester. It's so wonderful to have you with us here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here.
Thank you. To read even the cliff notes of Chester's bio is to be amazed at the depth and breadth of his accomplishments. Chester is a poet, most notably in the Episcopal world, as responsible for the retranslation of the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer, along with W.H. Auden, and for his poem about St. Paul's Chapel following the 9/11 attacks. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury Department in the Carter administration and has been a successful financial consultant for large domestic governments and nonprofits. Chester has written extensively on race and civil rights, composing the litany for the National Day of Repentance, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. I had the good fortune to meet Chester a few years ago at a Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration dinner, where he discussed the early stages of the writing of this book, Damaged Heritage. I was profoundly moved then, and can say after reading the finished product that this book is a deeply personal, powerful, and courageous account of Chester's discovery of and reckoning with the truth of his beloved grandfather's participation in the Elaine Race Massacre, his meeting of Sheila L. Walker, a descendant of African American victims of that massacre, and their commitment to a journey of racial reconciliation and abiding friendship. Chester, I can't thank you enough for this book and for being with us here today. Please tell us about Damaged Heritage.
Thank you very much, Susan. Good morning, everyone. I'm J. Chester Johnson, and I'm delighted to talk with you again. I was at St. Bart's a couple of years ago when I discussed my last book, Auden, the Psalms, and Me. Now I'm with you for an entirely different subject. On May the 5th, my most recent book, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation, was released, published by Pegasus and distributed by Simon & Schuster. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we can have a question and answer session to carry us further into the book and related topics. As we walk through the messages and contours of this book, I wish to underscore a crucial fact. Maybe I sound like I just left the Mississippi River Delta, though I've lived in New York City for many decades. Or maybe parts of the presentation sound apropos of headline Southern experience, but please do not assume this is a Southern book. It is not. While the South may carry a more glaring history of damaged heritage and its effects on racial subjugation, let us not be misled. Damaged heritage is a national problem, and wherever its use by whites against African Americans exists, then this book is relevant. I was asked to write the Litany of Offense and Apology for the National Day of Repentance, October the 4th, 2008, when the Episcopal Church formally apologized, with the presiding bishop officiating for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. As I conducted my research, I came across a 70-page treatise entitled The Arkansas Race Riot of 1919, written by the African American historian and anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells. It told of a terrible slaughter of Black sharecroppers and their family members, possibly the worst attack against African Americans in our country's history, with over 100 and possibly hundreds of Blacks perishing in Phillips County, located in southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River Delta. I grew up in southeast Arkansas, one county removed from the site of the massacre. None of my friends nor I ever knew a thing about this terrible event. I never heard about it at school and social gatherings at church. As I was to discover, for virtually everyone in the United States, the Elaine race massacre didn't exist as a murderous act in American history. Partially out of sheer anger that I had been duped by the evanescence of uncomfortable history, I began to examine attacks in southeast Arkansas against African Americans around the time of the Elaine race massacre after the end of World War I, and found that there had been lynchings and burnings of Blacks alive in the area, but none of these horrific and pernicious acts resulted in the 100+ deaths that occurred in the Elaine race massacre. I also began to recall a crucial personal story my mother told me many years before about my maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, the principal caretaker during the first 5 years of my life. She told me that when she was young, not yet a teenager, Lonnie, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, participated in what she called a well-known race riot, where many Blacks were killed in southeast Arkansas. My father died when I was 1, and my mother didn't do well for several years, so I lived with my maternal grandparents, Lonnie and Hattie Birch. Lonnie had just retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and he became my 24-hour-a-day caretaker. He was singularly the most important person during my earliest years. I adored him, and he adored me. Over time, based on my research, I concluded that the Elaine race massacre and the well-known race riot my mother relayed to me about my grandfather were one and the same. The terrain, the location of the killing fields, the proximity of the Birch farm, the significant role played by the Missouri Pacific Railroad, Lonnie's only employer his entire working career, the large number of African Americans killed, and much more all led to the same conclusion. My beloved grandfather had participated in the Elaine race massacre. In 1957 and 1958, the story about Lonnie and Elaine, together with a discussion about the then current racial turmoil, found their way into conversations between my mother and me when I was a young teenager. At the time, a nearby federal-state constitutional crisis was unfolding before us on television, radio, and in every newspaper. This crisis surrounded the integration of Little Rock Central High School, 100 miles away from Monticello, Arkansas, where I then lived. The subject of white racism, including its tragic and emotional divisiveness, has been with me ever since. I've studied it, I've spoken and written about it. It has also affected my life's physical migrations. During the summer of 1964, I sat in Quincy House along the Charles River at Harvard University. It was the summer before my junior year at Harvard. In June and July, hundreds of mostly white Northern students descended on Mississippi to register Black voters, to upset the state's racial norms, to open schools and political operations. All this cumulatively known as Freedom Summer. While the target of this northern advance was institutionalized racism, the geographic area given most attention was Northwest Mississippi, the area of the state conventionally known as the Delta, the sister locale just across the Great Muddy from Arkansas, from Phillips County in Monticello, my hometown. No wonder then that I dwelt repeatedly on accounts originating some 1,500 miles away. In the summer of 1964, the United States embarked on a racial reckoning, a battle beginning with the South as the target, but flaring into a national outrage for racial grievances everywhere. With black and white players frequently bearing a Southern accent, one heard ancient outcries for and against moral and human rectitude. Many of us think of that summer as the fulcrum, a torque that sent the nation into a racial revolution that has never ended. First, 3 civil rights workers with Freedom Summer were martyred in June in Neshoba County, Mississippi, followed by 200 federal investigators flooding the county to find the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. A search much of the nation followed with intensity and sympathetic anger. Then in July, the first seminal civil rights legislation of the 20th century was enacted by Congress and President Johnson around the same time that the Harlem race riots erupted as a harbinger of internal combustions and infernos for succeeding summers when ghetto riots spread like viral wildfires through American cities, one after another. A monumental question arose for me then. Should I continue to observe from afar in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or encounter for myself a turn to the other side of history? Looking back over time, I don't think I had a choice. For 3.5 years, I returned to the South and traveled through the region. I held a couple of jobs, wrote, and now and then attended classes at the University of Arkansas until I accumulated enough credits, enough with my Harvard credits to graduate. When I left Harvard in 1964, I came back to the South after Freedom Summer, mainly as a student, although I had my inclinations and underlying suppositions about the country's racial revolution. By 1968, as I left Arkansas for New York City, I had a firm grasp of myself in the context of race and the Black liberation movement. Then, following the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., I returned once again to the Mississippi River Delta, to Southeast Arkansas, but this time I put my more congealed and codified views about race and Black liberation to work by teaching in an all-African-American public school before integration of the local public education system. The significance and symbolic relevance of Freedom Summer are often dismissed today, intentionally so by many whites, I might add. For example, the following bit of history is usually forgotten or misplaced in retrospect. But Ronald Reagan, immediately following the Republican convention that launched his 1980 campaign as the party's nominee against Jimmy Carter, chose as his first campaign stop Neshoba County, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been brutally murdered by violent segregationists at the beginning of Freedom Summer. Reagan's states' rights message that early fall day in 1980 in Neshoba County was meant to appeal to those whites, both in Mississippi and across the nation, who had seen the 1964 racial liberation efforts in Mississippi coming from the North as a Sherman-esque invasion to perpetrate unwarranted and prodigal attacks on justified and long-lasting white supremacy. I grew up in an especially racist family in an especially racist region along the Mississippi River Delta, a region that heads of the NAACP had dubbed the Heart of Darkness, a region that has also been called part of the American Congo. 5 years after the Episcopal Church apologized for its role in slavery and related evils, I wrote a 10,000-word article for a literary magazine on the massacre, which started a journey to reconciliation and deep friendship with Sheila Walker, a descendant of African Americans who were victims of the conflagration in Phillips County. Sheila wrote the foreword to Damaged Heritage. I learned something disturbing about myself through the writing of that article. Notwithstanding the preponderance of facts and evidence that Lonnie had participated in the massacre, I used the term likely to describe his role. I had no excuse for using the ameliorative word likely. Shortly thereafter, though, as a result of my long-time rejection of the racist apparatus that surrounded me during my youth, I simply could not let my feelings and familial attachment for Lonnie erase or obscure the image of the racist person he had so clearly been. He then became and remains two distinctly separate people, a dutiful and caring grandfather from a less welcomed memory, but also an abhorrent gunman who sought to kill African Americans in a 1919 mass murder. My use of the term likely ultimately caused me to explore ways white Americans have frequently reacted to their collective and individual damaged heritage that has brought subjugation to Blacks over generations and several centuries. As a result of this personal challenge, I came to uncover the ability of generations of whites to tolerate the terrible treatment of Blacks in America. I acknowledged my attempt, as so many American whites, especially large numbers of white Southerners, had done before me, to lessen the effects of damaged heritage. It is crucial we understand that white folks have shielded themselves from damaged heritage through the adoption of an excessive veneration of ancestors, the past, and traditions, a feature Webster calls filial pietism. I believe both damaged heritage and filial pietism, taken together, are serious components of long-term and continuing racism. In fact, the influence of damaged heritage on white racism bears little potent capability without the psychological cover from filial pietism, which has excused, camouflaged, and sufficiently inoculated damaged heritage throughout our national history. We humans are not born with racism as a natural result of who we innately are. Rather, it is a trait we absorb as a condition of what we learn and have to unlearn if we are to free ourselves from this evil. I like to think that the commonality between all humans, let's call this commonality the genuinely human, far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, language, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, meager differences in these facets between us have often suggested to many whites the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. With the genuinely human in mind, I recall comments for guidance from the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote 170 years ago that one generation does not learn anything genuinely human from a past generation. In other words, we have to learn ever anew for ourselves the genuinely human, which certainly proved to be a remedy leading to the last 6 years of my reconciliation and friendship with Sheila Walker, descendant of Elaine victims. Kierkegaard's view that one generation cannot rely on a previous generation to learn the genuinely human warns us that filial pietism must and will inevitably embrace racism, at least in white America's case, since that revered past cast African Americans in a perpetual state of human subjugation. Therefore, we whites have to be especially careful today about those traditions to which we adhere, for if we're not, they will surely, as they have in the past, contain racist justification brought forward again and again. I believe my ancestors knew that their subjugation of Blacks was decidedly wrong. The mere existence of filial pietism suggests that they used reverence for the past to shadow and hide damaged heritage. We would indeed be wise, therefore, to ask ourselves this question today. Are there traditions that we now blindly adopt for ourselves that directly or indirectly endorse racism and thus project their power and existence for tomorrow? And yet, we should also feel eagerly challenged that we alone can open ourselves to the genuinely human, not bound by those who come before us. During the writing of my 2013 article on the Elaine race massacre, I had reached out to the writer Robert Whittaker, author of On the Lapse of Gods, the most definitive book on the Elaine race massacre. I asked him several questions to achieve clarification for my piece. In turn, he asked if I would meet an African American woman, a descendant of a family that experienced terrible white attacks during the massacre. I agreed. Sheila also agreed to meet with me, the two of us, progenies of the two sides. For our first communication in early 2014, Sheila and I had a telephone call that lasted 2 hours. We shared much personal information about our ancestors, victims, and perpetrator. We were both very comfortable with the conversation, notwithstanding some anxiety before the call. Several weeks later, Sheila and I met at her son's home in Boston. Whittaker picked me up at the train station and drove me to the house where Sheila's son, his wife, and their small children lived. As Bob pulled up in front of the house, I inadvertently peered at the second-story windows, and my eyes met those of a person I knew had to be Sheila. How long had she watched for us from the window? Sheila obviously shared a similar searching exercise I practiced in anticipation of that day. Immediately upon greeting each other, we embraced for a very long time. From the beginning, we meant to be the obverse, the alternative to the attitudes and episodes that characterized those early fall days of 1919 in Phillips County, Arkansas. Our friendship and reconciliation have now continued for over 6 years, with our spouses and children being brought into this relationship. Our journey, apparent from the outset, remained a road to reconciliation that recognized imperative history, which made sense of all we learned from beginning to end, discounting none of the most intrusive facts, regardless how uncomfortable. This is no small matter, for truth brought forward affects the way we act and react today and tomorrow. Based on revised and true history, we inevitably adjust our current behavior. For the relationship that developed out of our mutual history from the massacre, Sheila and I empowered our adherence to the genuinely human as a steadfast election on which we deeply depended. I've learned that we white folks often have a problem with both racial reconciliation and forgiveness. Oh, there may be the seemingly affirmative comments about blacks and whites getting along, but that's not what reconciliation and forgiveness are. The getting along test doesn't solve it. Since Lonnie remained for me divided between my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the riven composite of Lonnie's two personas by announcing both publicly in groups like this one and privately to my family and me that she forgave Lonnie more than I had. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the Phillips County conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of my tradition. By her forgiveness of Lonnie for his tendentious racist opinions and conduct and role in the massacre, she conveyed to me the assurance that I could proceed with her to friendship through a closer, honest dialogue, shared views, and personal stories a shared purpose, if you will. And on this foundation, a willingness and aspiration could be created between us. Without the prospect for forgiveness, exercised by those who sustained white aggression and who continue to carry long-term effects of the associated oppression, whites, with the consequential impact of multi-generational damaged heritage, are simply not able to forgive themselves. They have no resources for such a forceful act. Indeed, whites in general aren't into forgiveness, even the acceptance of forgiveness, which I believe is necessary for racial reconciliation. We always knew within ourselves that we could only be cleansed by those we had made our victims, black brothers and sisters among us. By so many measures, we whites must depend on African Americans to help guide us in a direction that will also allow us to forgive the what and who that have defined us in ways we often do not yet admit, and for so many, unfortunately, still choose to admire. More particularly, the use of forgiveness elevates African Americans and at the same time releases whites to be free of their traditional commissions, to turn whites from their historical participation in evil. Racial reconciliation strips away the previous context and replaces it with one that has set aside the evils and ravages of damaged heritage and filial pietism, one that has more fully taken on the adoption of the genuinely human. To receive another situation captures the will of one's own purpose, thus finding oneself in the place of another. Further, for someone connected to the oppressing side, historically speaking, this pursuit of the genuinely human and reconciliation with another of a separate race, combined with an acceptance of forgiveness from those oppressed, can remove the self-destructive nature of a seemingly immutable past transmuted to the present. For someone associated with the oppressed, to forgive the historical oppressor is an act of freedom for both, which can serve as an illumination and passage to a consciously elevated relationship. Racial reconciliation means the making of color irrelevant to all facets of our lives, economically, socially, spiritually. I propose we bring this idea always into a fully human setting, into a setting in which we can relate to the genuinely human possibility, simply put, to ourselves. Dealing with the special nature of race, we too often assign much of our own individual context to institutions, forsaking prospects we know we otherwise can bring entirely to bear between individual blacks and whites. While there is no doubt greater white activism at all levels is needed today in responding to racist episodes and comments, racial reconciliation is biracial, aligned with personally intense involvement. It is time for institutions to break open and free individuals of goodwill, black and white, to find each other in missions that result in authentic and public expressions for the genuinely human, depending instinctively on each other for the context, sentiments, and humanity to circumvent obstacles embedded in so many past ways and habits. I've occasionally let myself lean into the following possibilities. What if we whites allowed ourselves to pursue and fully embrace the genuinely human, accepting the commonality of all human beings, superseding and obviating those marginal facets such as accent, skin color, customs, and the like that American whites have used to segregate themselves from blacks? If all of that could happen, shouldn't we be able to mitigate, if not suppress, the long-living influence of filial pietism with its excessive reverence for ancestors, the past, and tradition? And if that were to happen, how could damaged heritage survive from generation to generation? And if we could add a little forgiveness, exercised by African Americans, the equivalent of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the weapon of love. And if we whites could accept that forgiveness from African Americans, the kind of forgiveness that Sheila showed Lonnie, or the kind of forgiveness that the families of those killed at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston showed to the white killer Dylan Roof, isn't it possible that, dare I say it, we can contemplate something beyond, something over the mountaintop, in visions like those of King and Isaiah that speak gently to us all about one to another, black to white, and white to black? Thank you.
Thank you, Chester.
Sure.
I appreciate those powerful words. I invite our viewers to propose questions for Chester, either on the Facebook or YouTube, or to email me directly at sandersonsmith@stbarts.org. And I have one question already. Chester, you used the word filiopietism. Can you just talk a little bit more, just sort of expand your understanding of that, and what are some ways that, some concrete examples or ways that expresses itself?
It's a great question. And maybe I can start with the definition that Webster gives it.
All right.
Which is excessive veneration of ancestors, past, and tradition. And I stumbled over the concept as I was doing all of this work on the Elaine race massacre. And I wove my own experience, my own background, and I make reference to it in the presentation, and that is my utilizing the word likely, and when in fact all the facts and evidence suggests without question that Lonnie participated in the massacre. But I shielded that recognition by the use of filiopietism. Maybe not in an excessive way, but I clearly did, and I came back to recognize that. But it is the important role of filiopietism is that it serves to excuse and camouflage damaged heritage. I actually do not believe, when you look at you define what damaged heritage is, which is this essential part of American white racism, that it's the evidence, that's passed on from one generation to another of ingrained prejudicial, traditions and customs that are sometimes codified into law, and that's historically combined with this not infrequent, gratuitous, and even severe violence and repression perpetrated by American whites against African Americans. And that's what I define that as damaged heritage. And I don't really think that white Americans could have continued from generation to generation. I mean, we're talking about 400 years, and could have continued that, the recognition of what they were doing to African Americans, without something that gave them the right to do it. And this right to do it is a function of grandparents, parents, and it allowed and as well as obviously the traditions and customs that brought with it, with that recognition of bloodline as well, and that created the ability for whites not only to implement this damaged heritage, but enjoy the economic advantages of racism, as well as other white privileges, social and white privileges. And that is what I have seen, and I believe that history has shown has been the insidious role of filial pietism over the life of this white racism as implemented over the 400 years.
Thank you. So I have sort of a follow-up question to that. A lot of controversy, a lot of passion around the removal of statues and monuments. How do you see the relationship between what you're explaining as filio-pietism and these sorts of impulses?
Well, I actually think that this is a perfect example of the elements of filio-pietism, the use of these symbolic instruments that bring forward the traditions and customs of racism and give a reason for accepting and inoculating, if you will, actions that are in fact racist in nature, but rely upon our dependency for those types of reminders and justification. And that is, I think those symbols are clearly that the symbols of monuments and to the defense of racism is exactly that. It's a form of filial pietism.
Thank you. A question from a viewer, Chester. What is the role of the government, as you understand it, as a representative of individuals and the nation? What is the role of the government to bring about this kind of reconciliation that you speak of?
Well, as you know, in my remarks, I actually make a comment that I'm reluctant to rely extensively. Obviously, government has a role for protection of all of its citizens. And the 14th Amendment, which was passed right after the Civil War, made it very clear. I mean, the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law. It made all slaves citizens of the United States. And those are the sorts of things that we should rely on and have government protect those rights in a very significant way. But at the same time, I think there's been less of attention paid to the one-to-one possibilities that exist with or by people of goodwill, blacks and whites, to come together in relationships of reaching mutual goals and activities but not relying extensively on government or on other institutions to always be fostering what we think will bring an end to, or at least amelioration or mitigation of racism. I just think that, I've gotten lots of letters since I wrote this book, and some people saying, "Hey, you know, there are a lot of people in this country with goodwill, and you know, why can't we all sort of develop a million sorts of relationship the way that you and Sheila have over time? Why can't we do that?" And I don't disagree with them. I actually think there's a reason that one-to-one relationships work. They do, and I think that, and I encourage that. So, at the same time, government should be relying on such constitutional protections that exist for equal treatment and affirmative action where gross inequities have existed. But I also think that there's a lot more than that individuals can do with each other, black and white, that we tend not to respect our excess as a capability in a way that we could.
Thank you. One viewer is very interested in what you understand reparations might mean today. The concern being that some folks have the idea that it's about paying money for past abuses, which seems simple, too simple, perhaps ineffective. And what's your sense of reparations?
Well, I've had discussions with, I don't know if the name Catherine Meeks means anything to, but
Yes.
She runs the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, and it's associated with the Episcopal Church and this. And actually, we've had several discussions over my book, for people, for groups. And she really has convinced me that rather than, I mean, there's a certain inflammatory aspects of, for some people, related to the idea of reparations as sort of a lump sum payment that reflects. And Catherine, obviously, I mean, she's African American, and she's dealt with these issues her whole life. And I'm using her because she sort of influenced my thinking about this. That reparations should be seen in the context of really genuinely establishing level playing field in the world that we live in. That somehow we get away from the more cheapened life that exists for African Americans. And that we earnestly and collectively and even organizationally pursue a methodology or a form that creates an environment where we really do have the ability for African Americans to compete and to be treated with the same equity and the value of life that exists for whites. And what we can call it whatever we want to, but that is, at least from her perspective, and I respect her on this viewpoint, because it's really been, she's convinced me on this, that is a form of reparations that we should try to seek, because it not only affects the sort of the economic aspects of it, but it also commits all of us to a spiritual renewal at the same time. Okay. And I think those two would be it would be a significant accomplishment. We can call it reparations, but that's effectively the result.
Okay. Thank you. A lot of your remarks today, and of course, much of your writing in the book, it either mentions or is predicated upon your understanding of forgiveness as a part of this reconciliation. We have a viewer who wants to, who's a little uncomfortable with the idea of Blacks needing to forgive whites. And while it's liberating for all, what is it? There's a sense that whites need to earn this forgiveness, perhaps with actions. Can you speak to that, since it's so prominent for you?
Yeah, and that viewpoint that was expressed is not an isolated viewpoint. In fact, I had a disagreement with an interviewer, a radio interviewer, last week, and I followed up with a written piece because the interviewer was saying that there are those who even attack the forgiveness that was shown by the relatives of the victims at the Mother Emanuel Church, and said it was a Stockholm syndrome that caused them to do that, and which, in my opinion, demeans the integrity of sort of the remarkable forgiveness that was shown. It's my opinion that whether we're Christians or non-Christians, that the form of forgiveness or the act of forgiveness has significant impact. I know that there was a line when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up in South Africa. There was a line in terms of the rationale of, and it was something like, forgiveness is not only an act of altruism, it's also the best act for self-interest. And of course, Desmond Tutu had a lot to do with the way in which the philosophy was shaped there. Also, if you look at the private papers of Martin Luther King, and he talks about forgiveness in the context not of Christianity clearly, but that it is a pardon, it is a renewal. We start anew with the use of forgiveness. So both parties should be transfixed on starting new, and that it is incumbent, especially on Christians, to move through the use of, or either acceptance of forgiveness or giving that forgiveness as an act of social activism. And he actually, in his private papers, he makes the point that the solution to a significant part of the solution to racism exists in that simple act of forgiveness. And I have to say, the thing that affected me, it was just and it may have been only my reaction, but when Sheila Walker and I first got to know each other, I actually did worry. How does the fact that my grandfather participated in this event how does that affect our relationship, Sheila and my relationship? And I was concerned about it. I didn't voice it necessarily, but it was something I felt. I mean, I didn't participate in the massacre. I don't feel guilty about that, but it is something that I inherited, and I I have to deal with, or I've sort of forced it into the future. But I was concerned about it. Sheila White wiped all of that clean. When she got up and said, in sort of an environment like not Zoom, but in a public environment, I forgive Lonnie, and I can tell you I forgive him more than Chester does. And I have had trouble forgiving Lonnie. There's no question about it. I still have trouble forgiving Lonnie. But that just created a brand new environment for Sheila and I to exercise friendship and abiding friendship and love. And it was an act of generosity. And I understand the idea of our earning it. It's the question of who our is. And it's also so I'm blithering a bit, but that's my generally response to it. It's really an important element, as you can probably tell, in the relationship that Sheila and I have developed. And it's also an element that I think that I believe whites need to earn that, and it shouldn't be gratuitously given. And it's part of the whites should not get it through what Bonhoeffer might call cheap grace, but it is something that reflects our commitment to something that is greater than our past. And yes, we need to earn it, but at the same time, it's an absolutely essential aspect of racial reconciliation as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. I am so sorry we have to bring our time together to a close. There are more questions. Our rector, Bishop Dean Wolf, wanted me to extend his greetings to you and his gratitude for the work that you're doing and for your time with us today. I want to say that for those of you whose questions we did not get to, please read Chester's book. It's stunningly beautiful and poignant. Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Race Massacre, and a Story of Reconciliation. Chester, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
If there's anything that St. Bart's can do for you and support you in this important work, I hope that you will not hesitate to reach out to us. And we're deeply, deeply grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Blessings to everyone.